session is now open for some questions. And the lights are blinding me, so hands up, please. We have about 10 minutes. We have one to the front here. If you could indicate who you are, if we can have the microphone, please. Front here, if you could indicate who you are. Thank you very much.
Professor Eunice Simmons, Nottingham Trent University, unusual civic university in that it's invested in its agricultural campus. You mentioned diffusion a couple of times, and it wasn't entirely clear who this knowledge needed to be diffused to. Are you suggesting that companies perhaps aren't taking up opportunities to pick up technologies that have been invented perhaps in the institutes or in universities? You know, where's the gap?
I think that the big gap is actually, once the innovation has been made, it's how innovation spreads through farming communities, for example. How that knowledge transfer happens. And you know, whether there are the right advisory mechanisms, whether there are the right incentives for people to take the necessary risks associated with innovation. It's a problem in every profession. As you gathered, my own profession is medicine, and there a variety of mechanisms, NICE, for example, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, was created as a way of signalling to the medical profession what works, and equally important, what doesn't work. You know, at least as much as rooting out bad practice as putting in good practice. But I don't think the same mechanisms exist in every area of industry, and I think there may be a particular challenge in farming, although I think others are better equipped to tell me whether that's true or not.
Question to my right here.
Thank you very much. Paul Silcott from Cumulus Consultants. Not a scientist at all, but given the challenges and opportunities ahead, do you think there's enough research and innovation in agriculture and land management?
That's a sort of how long is this piece of string question, really, because I'm not sure that there's absolutely the right answer. We have a lot of talented researchers. I think there could always be more. And, of course, the challenge is bringing through the next generation. And I think, again, that's one of the issues for the agricultural community, which is actually making sure that future generations come through. But I mean, the answer is we do quite a lot, but I think there's always the opportunity for more.
Okay, question just here, yep. You could have the microphone, front right. And then we'll take a question from the app.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a most interesting paper. From an Irish perspective, looking at this unifying of an enormous budget for research, what kind of methodology do you have for sifting through the thousands of applications you must get? Who sets the actual policy in the very broadest sense? And how, as Chief Executive, do you react to that? Or is your board sufficiently representative of the whole thought process that the answers almost automatically float to the surface?
If only the answer automatically float to the surface. No, they don't. But we have, I mean, the first thing to say is we have a very good board chaired by Sir John Kingman. But I mean, the answer is that we are building on a century's history of very successful research and innovation funding in the UK. So the one thing we have not done is taken 7 research councils, Innovate UK, and the part of the dual support system that we have in UKRI, bunged it together into a single organisation and thrown a blender in. That would have been an extremely bad mistake. So we're building on a very strong legacy. And of course, the fundamental principle that we use is expert review, what's called peer review. So we choose proposals based on expert review so that we can try and put our money where experts think that there is there's a talented team and reasonable chance of success. Although, of course, if you're funding research, that's a high-risk activity, and you don't expect every research project to be a raging success.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to take a question on the app quickly. Why does the public often not trust science and agriculture, but does trust science and medicine?
That's a really interesting question. It's where research conflicts with human values that you run into trouble. And so when people think that science and research is telling them how to live their lives, it tends to be less well trusted. And so, I mean, a very good example is the Higgs boson. So when the Higgs boson was discovered, researchers went on the radio and they described it, and people were absolutely fascinated. Everyone thought it was absolutely wonderful. The main critics of the researchers that went on the radio were other physicists who said they hadn't described it properly. When a researcher goes on to the radio to talk about embryo technologies or genetically modified organisms or anything where it conflicts with some people's human values, that's when it's not trusted. And that's where I think it's important that we try and separate the discussion of the science from the discussion of the human values and recognize that some people are conscientiously opposed to certain science, certain technology, certain uses of it. But that shouldn't be a criticism of the science. The science is the science, the technology is the technology, it's how we use it. And so trust is very, very concrete and specific. And so a researcher, and so when I was the government chief scientific advisor, the second I went on the radio and talked about neonicotinoid pesticides, and I can see Charles Godfrey sitting in the audience who provided a lot of help in terms of reviewing the science at the time, I immediately wasn't trusted at the time because there's an enormous amount of values-laden debate about that. If I was talking about other topics, I'd be perfectly trusted.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move now using the technology to the East School. So we have a question coming through from the East School on the screen.
Thank you. Joe Gibson, I'm a farmer and butcher in the north of Scotland and one of this year's emerging leaders. At the moment, beef and lamb is getting a hammering for carbon emissions, but is carbon emissions too simple a metric for calculating our agricultural climate impact? Should we also be looking at other metrics such as the level of nutrients provided and also the arable land use?
Well, I mean, the answer is that you always need to take an integrated approach and look at all of the impacts. And then there's obviously a balance. But I mean, carbon emissions are obviously a very significant component, including obviously methane.
Okay. There's a question again to my immediate left, down the back there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Gooding, Map of Agriculture. So Mark, this question about spreading of information. On the Farming Conference app, there is a poll of farmers, recent poll, which shows that roughly about a third of them would prefer just to maintain the status quo and not adapt to any change at all. I wonder at what point it is we should just cast those people adrift and stop worrying about trying to spread information and convince them to change when they don't want to. Or would that be a completely unethical position to take?
Well, I think that's a sort of economic and political question, which I'm going to sort of slightly duck because I think everyone will have a different view on that and there isn't an absolute right answer. But there does come a point when if there are certain practices that are completely unacceptable, then that's where regulation has a place. But I mean, these are all trade-offs. And of course, the whole business of subsidy is about actually providing trade-offs at a time of change.
Okay. We have a question in front of me. If you stand up, yep, good. The mic, please.
Lockwood Smith, humble farmer from New Zealand. Question is, today we've heard quite a few people refer to things like the inexorable rise of veganism or veganism. We've heard a very enthusiastic, passionate appeal to increase our vegetable consumption. You heard Matt Smith refer to, who incidentally, his father's my cousin. You heard Matt refer to the interesting situation we're just finding in New Zealand at the moment, where with the reduction in consumption of red meat, we're seeing what appears to be quite a significant increase in the cost of healthcare for people becoming anemic through insufficient iron in their intake. Now, we humans evolved without being able to digest cellulose.
Indeed.
And what's more, we require certain essential amino acids that few plants produce. And one of the great benefits of the agricultural system is that the ruminant animal can both digest cellulose and produce the essential amino acids that we need. How are you going to get through the ignorant group think that's out there to better inform the public about what a healthy diet really is and about the human physiology that means we are actually dependent on certain nutrients from creatures like ruminant animals.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I suppose I challenge the word inexorable slightly. I mean, there certainly is a fashion at the moment, and there is increasing vegetarianism and veganism, but of course it's not worldwide. And if you look at China, for example, where the demand for meat is going up relentlessly, and I think that the point I made at the beginning of my presentation, which is that actually, if you look at our generation, we are on the whole taller, healthier, and more long-lived than previous generations, and that is because actually we have a diverse diet. I mean, we clearly have evolved as omnivores. Our dentition shows that we are omnivorous, and I suspect that we will come to some equilibrium in the long term. My late colleague David Mackay, when he did the 2050 calculator, which was basically a spreadsheet that the public could use to model different ways towards achieving the carbon targets for the planet by 2050. If you turned the dial and made the whole human population vegetarian, it would get us most of the way to 2050 very, very quickly. So there's no question that if we can reduce meat consumption, that would be a good thing to do in planetary terms. In health terms, we do depend on a diverse diet. I was speaking to my colleague Ian Boyd the other day, who has talked about other potential sources for meat-like products as well. In other words, the ability to engineer some of the molecules that we find in meat into plants, for example. And so there are plant-based products that have the potential, if they're engineered, to provide nutrition. But I mean, I suppose I'd end by saying I think that we are omnivorous. We will continue almost certainly to have balanced diets. I think it's not a question of whether we cut out all meat, but whether we actually reduce the amount we eat somewhat, which probably wouldn't damage our health and would be good for the planet.
And with that, Mark, I'd like
Short answer.
Thank you. With that, Mark, I'd like to thank you for your presentation here today and for addressing the questions very well indeed. So thank you indeed, Mark.